Okay, we are live. Let me make sure we are recording.
It says recording.
It says recording. Great.
It says live and recording.
Amazing. Okay. Thank you all for those who are joining live and for those who will tune in on all platforms afterwards. My name is Isaac Simon. I'm with Jewish Original Media, and today we're pleased to have on Nadav Heller. Nadav is a Jewish studies educator pursuing a BA, MA at Yeshiva University. A wealth of knowledge, Nadav's opinions are well-crafted and erudite, and I feel fortunate to call him a friend. Nadav, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Isaac. That's a very kind introduction. I hope it's one that I can live up to today.
No, of course. So today we are talking about spiritual resistance and spirituality during times of war and tribulation. And one of the things that I think that a lot of people, including myself, get confused by is the difference between being religious and being spiritual. So I was curious how you would separate the two. Obviously, there's clear overlap, but I know that I've met a lot of people who say they're spiritual and not religious, and I think sometimes it can be confusing to parse the difference. So how would you define each?
That's a really interesting question. I think that spirituality speaks to a degree of interiority that religiosity doesn't necessarily need to speak to. And just to think about the etymology for a second, right? Like the word religion comes from religare, which means to bind. So religion is a lot more about, responsibility and about a sense of obligation to me, to community, to self, to a divine power than spirituality, which is much more about an internal feeling of closeness to things that matter. And I don't know, those two things are both very powerful and very important. And I think that any good religion has an element of spirituality, and any sort of meaningful spirituality has an element of obligation. But to the extent that those two things overlap, I think I see religion as being a lot more about responsibility and obligation, and spirituality as being a lot more about personal sense of fulfillment or connection. That makes sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And when it comes to finding that fulfillment and connection, how has that been an active resistance throughout Jewish history, and how do Jews continue to find that connection during times of war and conflict?
Sure. So, for the audience that may not know, I have the distinct pleasure of working with Isaac at the Museum of Jewish Heritage. And when he mentioned spiritual moments during dark times in Jewish history, obviously one of the first places my mind went was the Shoah, the Holocaust, which was undoubtedly one of the darkest times, not just in Jewish history, but in human history. And one of the primary themes of the tour that Isaac and I give there is this spiritual sense of resistance, right? Um, the tour features a couple of artifacts like a dark blue sports blouse with the Star of David on it, worn by a German Jewish girl after Kristallnacht. There's a dented spice box used in the closing ritual of the Sabbath, the Havdalah, that was smuggled in and out of a concentration camp. We have a wire and bead flower basket created by a teenager as a birthday gift in a labor camp. And those are all examples of resistance of spirit, I think. So I think that when one of the ways that Jewish people resist spiritually is not just in terms of religious obligation, to segue back to the first question, but also in terms of finding locuses of meaning and holding those locuses of meaning, of family, of spiritual engagement, of identity closer, the more that the enemy tries to take them away. So I think that that's a really important thing to think about. And I'll also add that I think that when we usually think about spiritual responses to dark times, we might think of like starry-eyed faith or resolute acceptance or miraculous stories of survival, because that's the mold that we're often given. I actually think there are a lot of interesting perspectives in the Jewish tradition that break that mold a little bit. And maybe we could talk about some of this today.
Yeah, please.
Okay, well, to reference the Shoah, I think that one of the interesting reactions that we see is anger. In the wake of the Shoah, many survivors felt anger and hatred toward the parties that they held responsible for their experiences. So, Abba Kovno, for example, and his partisan movement Nakam sought to take revenge on the Nazis and, in a way, to do to them what they did to him. He unsuccessfully attempted to poison the food supply of the prisons where Nazis were held. Um, and that doesn't really seem like the tolerant, world weary wisdom we learn about in textbooks. It's a lot more raw, it's a lot more furious than that. Naomi Seidman, who's a Jewish professor in Canada, writes very evocatively about the difference between Elie Wiesel's Night, which is characterized by the experience of bearing the haunting silence and the suffering of the Shoah, and his Yiddish language memoir of Und die Welt hat geschwiegen, and the world was silent, whose very title attests to a smoldering resentment, and the content of which is much more fiery and vengeful. So, I won't condone violence as a response to suffering, but I think that this is a form of spiritual resistance, that this is a clear unwillingness to just accept the darkness. It's a bursting forth of the Jewish spirit and a resounding no to the things that were perpetrated against them. And these survivors wouldn't accept what happened to them, and they refused to agree to silently bow their heads as martyrs. And I think that there's something really like extremely spiritually rejuvenating and self-affirming about an unwillingness to swallow that kind of suffering. So in that way, I think that anger is a really important spiritual response to dark times. Actually, it reminds me, there's a piece from Rabbeinu Nissim of Gerona, a Catalonian Talmudist of the medieval period, where he claims that it's forbidden to be oved lahachis, to worship an idol in order to mock it. And he writes that anger is a form of relationship. So by being angry at this idol or by mocking it, you're forming a relationship with that idol. Um, I think that that's a really relevant point here. That like when you're angry at someone or something, it means you believe that they should have been held accountable to behave differently. That you trusted them or you expected them to do something, and that and they violated your trust, and that hurts because you expected better. And as long as you carry that anger around, you carry the vestiges of that sublimated relationship around too. So that is a sense of spiritual connection, of anger, of a hope that something would have been different. And I also think that there's like a second logical step that emerges from that, that you also need to have a strong enough sense of self to feel anger for the ways that you're mistreated. So if someone hurts you or someone hurts a survivor, and that survivor believes that they deserved it, then they might accept it, they might internalize it. And feeling angry only comes from a sense that you should have been treated better. And in that way, anger is not just exemplary of a relationship with the one at whom you are angry, but it's exemplary of it shows a relationship with yourself as well, of a certain form of like uprightness, of spiritual resistance, of refusal to accept mistreatment. So sorry, sorry if I went on a
No,
little long there, but
no.
I definitely
You
think that
mentioned
anger is like an important spiritual response to think about.
no, and I'd like you to, if you would like, I would love for you to expand on that. I mean, you mentioned Abba Kovner, you mentioned the Rosenberg Spice Box. The Are there other points, like when we're talking about spiritual resistance, in what ways do we see Jews resisting in the Holocaust entering into a long line and a rich history of resistance that preceded the Holocaust? So when we talk about the spiritual resistance within the Jewish people pre 20th century, in what ways were they carrying on this same kind of fighting vengeance, this spirit that we see sort of evocative of in the post-war period?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I think that the first place my mind goes when you mention that is the Crusades in the early medieval period and Jewish responses to the Crusades. Um, One of the most important histories of the Crusades, written by Ephraim of Bonn, is written in an almost like liturgical meter. And it's written as like a form of kina or a lamentation that is supposed to be recited or reviewed, not as a critical history, but as a form of like memorialization. And so I think that there's a way of turning that hurt and that pain into into like a form of religious worship that I think is really common throughout this period, or turning it into a form of memory, like taking one thing that's very common in this memoir of the Crusades is that it uses a lot of imagery or language from the Megillah, from the Fern story. And so it compares, Haman to the Crusaders, and it compares the Jews to Esther and the Jewish people in Persia at that time. And so I think that a lot of Jewish history sees Jewish history as like a continuously rhyming process that repeats itself and or that rhymes with itself. So I think that the types of responses that we see to the Shoah are often like much more exaggerated versions of responses that we've seen throughout a lot of Jewish history. But some of them are, unique because of the 20th century context and because of, the severity of the Shoah. So some of them are a little bit different, but I think that a lot of the same responses we see are consistent throughout Jewish history.
Where in Jewish law do we see, where in halacha do we see sort of direct comments, or what part of halacha has commented or has been interpreted as this is proper ways to behave or rules for resistance?
Okay, so this is a really interesting question. And I think that there are two parts of the question. One is like the technical halachic element of like the behavior that are mandated by halacha. And the second is the attitude or the halachic attitude. And I guess I'll talk a little bit about the halachic attitude
Please.
first, and then I'll talk about some examples. Um, so I mentioned before that anger has some sort of narrativized looking into the past element to it, but there's like a somewhat untraditional halachic approach as the exact opposite. I think is worth discussing. Um, so the halacha is a binding system of laws and one that demands uncompromising obedience from its adherents. And the halachic perspective is one of responsibility and of obligation, which might be part of why my definition of religion has to do with responsibility and obligation. So Rabbi Joseph Dov Soloveitchik, a great Orthodox pole star of the previous century, and in many ways a champion of the halachic system of thought, proposes a very halachic perspective on dark times in Jewish history. And in his work, Kol Dodi Dofek, the voice of my beloved Naketh, Rabbi Soloveitchik replaces theodicy, which is the reconciliation of God's goodness with the evil of the world, with an action-based directive. So Rabbi Soloveitchik asking, how could God let this happen, is not an appropriate question for the halachic Jew. And rather, one should ask, and I'll quote from Kol Dodi Dofek, he should ask, what obligation accrues to the sufferer as a result of his suffering? What commanding heavenly voice breaks through from the midst of suffering? There is no need for metaphysical speculation in order to clarify the rules of rectifying evil. So this kind of comes from a sense that evil pervades and there's nothing you can do to stop it. And maybe there's not even so much you can do to understand it, but that you must absolutely do something to rectify it. And regardless of what suffering man sees or experiences, he has an enduring and absolute responsibility to fulfill the larger imperative that calls out from his circumstance. So a halachic thinker can never fatalistically accept a situation which can be changed. So Rabbi Soloveitchik's theodicy is really an anti-theodicy of action, characterized by like a concrete pragmatism and an abstinence from metaphysical pretensions. And this is really like the opposite of Abba Kovner's rage. It eschews the past. It's like he says, forget the history, forget the treatment you deserve. You have work to do. Um, and I think that that sort of attitude is actually reified in halachic practice or in the way that Jews viewed halachic practice in times of struggle. So one example would be the Kovno ghetto. Just to tie this back into the Shoah, this was part of the extant Holocaust literature, is that Rabbi Ephraim Oshri, a distinguished rabbi in the Kovno ghetto, fielded all these absurd questions of Jewish law while in the camps. I mean, like really stuff that is unimaginable. Here, wait, I'll pull one up. Do you mind if I read one?
Please.
One of these responsa? Okay. So here's the question he received. On the 6th of March, 5702, that's October 27th, 1941, 2 days before the horrifying Black Day of the Kovno Ghetto, where some 10,000 men, women, and children were taken away to be butchered, every one of the ghetto dwellers saw his or her bitter end coming. At that time of confusion, one of the respected members of the community came to me with tears on his cheeks and posed the question of life and death. He felt that he could not bear to see his wife, children, and grandchildren put to death before his very eyes. For the German sadists had a system for extermination. In order for the murderers to enjoy the suffering of their victims, as a matter of course, they would kill children before the eyes of their parents, and the women before the eyes of their husbands. Only after satisfying their bloodlust in a sadistic fashion would they put an end to the suffering of these men. Because he felt certain that it would be too painful to witness the horrible suffering of his loved ones, he asked whether he could terminate his own life earlier to avoid witnessing the deaths of his loved ones. This way, besides being spared a horrible death of great suffering at the hands of the accursed murderers, he would also gain burial among the Jews in the Jewish cemetery in the ghetto. So, I mean, imagine receiving a question like this. I mean, and his response, he has 5 volumes of responsa from the Kovna ghetto. I mean, really, just there are dozens of questions like these. Like another one was a pregnant woman was shot and dying, and a doctor wanted to know if he could take the risk of performing an emergency C-section if he wasn't sure whether the this rabbi buried them in the Kovna ghetto. And after the war, he survived. He returned. He unearthed them and reviewed each of them, and then published a 5-volume work of halachic responsa called Shut Ma'amakim, responsa from the depths. And I mean, there's something beautiful about that. Like from this unspeakably horrible situation, there emerges like not a narrative memoir or a theological philosophy, but a ritual precedent for future generations. Like he takes the Holocaust and produces from it halachic literature. Um, and it actually kind of makes me think of the Garden of Stones at the
I was,
museum.
wow, yeah, I was on that wavelength. Yeah.
Yeah. So at our museum, we close every tour by visiting the Garden of Stones, which is a really beautiful art piece by Andy Goldworthy that consists of a series of massive boulders, each with a tree growing out of its center. And the austere, lifeless rock that is unsupportive of life, that cannot imagine a future, yields these new sprouting trees. It's an obvious metaphor, and one that I think is really typified by studying these responsa, that we meld centuries of textual precedent and the horrific suffering of circumstance, and then put that composite into conversation with yeshiva students in 2024. I mean, I really think there's something really powerful about that. So part of the halachic response is not just, the looking forward toward asking. It's not just asking what does my suffering demand of me, but it's also asking how can I produce from my suffering something of religious value that will fuel or that will provide some sort of comfort or instruction to future generations who are likely to experience suffering as well.
So in that sense, the history itself informed the halacha that came after it, in the case of the rabbi that you mentioned, which is really interesting. I think oftentimes we view, the history of Jewish communities as being, like the halacha is passed down from generations, not just by experience, but just by how it was written. And it's interesting to see the way in which sort of the environment in which whether it's conflict or whether it's prosperity, can impact and then infect the evolution of those halachic practices as well. I mean, if that makes sense.
Well, that makes so much sense that I actually think it's biblical. I think that the way that it is written is often a product of occurrences. So, for example, in the Bible, in the book of the Midbar, of Numbers, the entire laws of inheritance are recorded there, but they aren't recorded in a vacuum. The only reason why they're provided is in response to the bequest of the 5 daughters of Tzlafchad, who asked if their father passed away. He didn't have any sons, and he didn't have a system to bequeath his property to his descendants because he didn't have any sons. So his daughters approach Moses and they say, "Hey, why should we be left out of having any inheritance? Why should the name of our family be erased just because he didn't have any sons? Grant us, give us a chance to hold it." And so God responds with a comprehensive system of all the laws of inheritance, right? The son is the first to inherit, and if the son can't inherit, then the daughter inherits, and if he doesn't have a son or a daughter, then the father or the brother inherits, and there's like this whole and chapters of the Talmud are written analyzing this section that was only ever reified into law in response to a historical occurrence. So I think that the idea that the way that it's written is sort of like this ossified vacuum of like objectivity is not really true. Like even the written law developed within a historical context and in response to the experiences of the Jewish people. And I think that that continues to be true. I mean, it's like pseudo biblical the way that Rabbi Oshri wrote these responsa and like in the time of the Holocaust. It's like this is a long Jewish tradition. We've always done this.
What do you think what's the difference between defense or self-defense and resistance?
Can you explain that question?
Yeah, so I think that when talking about spiritual resistance and the relationship, we've been talking a little bit about how spiritual resistance overlaps with physical resistance, knowing to act and what it means to have sort of physical faith. And I don't know, when you were talking, I was thinking about what does it mean to coming out of the Shoah, a lot of both survivors and scholars said that to survive is to resist. So there's resisting in one. So that's one kind of resistance. Just to survive and to live is a way of resisting Nazi oppression. But moving beyond that to like, what does it mean to resist in order to live, to continue to live, versus to defend one's life in order to continue living? And is there, in this case, or what we've been talking about today, would the two be synonymous? Or is there sort of like how you parse the difference between being religious and being spiritual? Is there a barrier or is there a limit where sort of defense and resistance do not align?
Yeah, okay, that's a really thoughtful question. I think that the way that I see it, and to some extent this is going to come down to like semantics and how people word, but what it makes me think of is whether your resistance is about your internality or whether it's a response or whether it's to stick it to someone else. So I'll give an example. One of the most important post-Holocaust theologians, in my opinion, is Emil Fackenheim. And one of Fackenheim's most famous, Jewish post-Holocaust ideas is the 614th commandment, and the idea that because of the horrors of the Holocaust, where the Jews were the Nazis attempted to incinerate the Jews, and the Nazis were like the epitome of evil, and the Jews, by resisting the Nazis, were like the epitome of good. The 614th commandment, and to add on to the 613 biblical commandments, is to not give Hitler a posthumous victory and to continue to survive in the wake of the Holocaust. And a lot of critics, opposed Fackenheim for many reasons, but prime among them that my Jewish identity is not a, middle finger to somebody else. I have a vivid and internal Jewish world, and I have, my own obligations and my own relationships and my own religion, and I exist despite the Nazis, not to spite the Nazis. And so I think that one of the things that is really moving to me about resistance is the way that it's about me and what I value, right? When a young Jewish woman wears a blouse with the Star of David on it, she's not doing that to anger the Nazis. She's doing that to demonstrate that the Nazis can't defeat her or make her afraid of being who she is. So I think that that's a form of resistance. But there's a second kind, which is, that in the language of the Talmud, right? When somebody attempts to kill you, rise and kill him first. And there is like very much a sense of self-defense and the necessity of a resistance that is more than spiritual. And that is that if somebody is trying to kill you or trying to eradicate or delegitimize your existence, it's not enough to just say, well, I will remain internally resolute. Like that's not gonna that it's not going to save Anne Frank in the attic, no matter
Right.
how much internal resolution she has. So I think that there are those two elements, right? There's like a Fackenheim model of resisting as a form of like outward expression to either show a message or to spite an enemy. And then there's a form of resistance that's like very internal about refusing to accept or to internalize the narrative of whoever is trying to, put upon you or destroy you.
No, I like that. The in the, this this comment of mine will bring us to the current moment, but in the wake after the Holocaust, we see the inclusion of various prayers. We see, within certain sects of Jewish observance, at least in the United States, we see additional prayers at the Passover Seder. We see prayers during the high holidays to, whether it's to honor the direct memory of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, or to say a prayer which incorporates the murdered 6 million Jews. And most recently, at my Passover Seder, I read the prayer for the hostages that was the one that was written by Rabbi Lau, the chief rabbi of Israel. And so, to what degree do these prayers, or the power of prayer itself, also factor in to this conversation of resistance that we've been having? And there's, and not to get, no, we can get right into it. I mean, the current war that's going on has also it's also reignited conversations about what does it mean to fight, and what does it mean to defend one's country. And and again, the media will sort of pit the Jew that's davening versus the Jew in the IDF uniform sort of against one another. And I think one of the great misunderstandings is that they're really on the same side, and that both are necessary. So what role does modern day physical and spiritual resistance play, whether it's from a prayer perspective, but also like a fighting perspective, and how we view what's currently taking place?
Mm-hmm. Okay, so I'll admit that, ani hakatan, that I'm just a student, and I'm a little bit leery of like that sort of, pseudo legal application to temporary circumstances, like a little bit
Yeah.
above my pay grade. But I will say that I think that what you're describing sounds a lot more like true prayer than, the sort of liturgy that we've, concretized in books, right? If we look at the liturgy that Orthodox Jews currently pray from, or that traditional Jews currently pray from, is one that was written about 2,000 years ago, right, in the post-biblical period by the Anshe Knesset Hagdolah, the men of the Great Assembly. And while those prayers draw heavily on our tradition and they're very powerful, they're just meant to be a template to evoke communion with the divine. And I think that if you look at like biblical precedents for the prayer, like Hannah's prayer in the beginning of the book of Samuel, or similar examples, there's the prayer is really reacting to circumstance by calling out to God. And that's reified in halacha as well. Um, there's a famous disagreement between two medieval commentators, Maimonides and Nachmanides, about the nature of the obligation to pray and when one is obligated to pray. And Maimonides claims that someone is obligated to pray every single day once. And Nachmanides retorts that in actuality, one is only required to pray in response to an eight sarah, a time of sorrow or a time of great distress. And in trying to bridge the gap between these two commentaries, Rabbi Soloveitchik, who I mentioned earlier, suggests that they are actually completely aligned, and that they agree, that Maimonides agrees that the time when you're supposed to reach out to God is a time of stress and suffering, but that someone who recognizes, his teleological place in the world, every day is a moment of great need and a moment of, reliance on the divine. And so, yes, you are correct. You are only obligated to pray in response to a time of need, but when you look through the proper lens, every day is actually a time of need. And so Maimonides and Nachmanides, according to Rabbi Soloveitchik, are actually saying the same thing in different words. And I think that that's a powerful thing to think about, is like, according to Rabbi Soloveitchik and Nachmanides and Maimonides, these great authorities, what prayer is a response to suffering and hardship. And whether that response to suffering and hardship comes in the form of the words that we've been saying for 2,000 years is less the point than that we react to those experiences by reaching out to God and by praying. Um, so, personally, I find that often the prayers that we have in the prayer books suffice, but that's not always the case. And we need to write new prayers and we need to have personal prayers. And I think that that's important too.
Yeah. And what is that? And can you speak a little bit about that process? Like, how does someone write new prayers? Or is that just an individual? Are you just commenting on an individual level?
I do mean it on an individual level. I think that there are, some rabbinic figures, and I think that this is more true in more progressive movements than the Orthodox circles that I'm usually part of, that they're much more likely to write new prayers, and beautiful prayers. But even within my circles, like, there are often new stanzas added to old prayers that some rabbis suggest saying, or like you mentioned, saying prayer at the Passover Seder for the hostages, or saying a prayer in memoriam of those who perished in the Holocaust in synagogue. Like, those are things that my Orthodox synagogue does. Um, so I think that part of it is, the way that I guess prayer becomes standard is someone writes something that there's a consensus is like a thing worth saying. They're like, oh, this is a good prayer. I actually had a funny experience when I was in the Old City a couple of years ago in Jerusalem, and our tour guide brought us to the Karaite synagogue there, because there are about 30,000 Karaites who only observe the biblical law and don't accept the rabbinic law, who live in Israel. And there was a Karaite man there, and I struck up a conversation with him in Hebrew. And he said to me that in his synagogue, they use the same prayer books that we use. And I asked him why. Like, you don't accept the authority you don't accept rabbinic authority. And he said, well, I mean, they're pretty good prayers. Like, we really like those prayers, so we use them because they're good. And I think that that's kind of like the way that it becomes standard practice. Is like, you can have your own personal prayers, and there's some, rabbinic figures that I'm familiar with that are really champions of that. Rabbi Dov Zinger, from Israel, from Gush Etzion, is a very prominent example. He wrote a book called Tikkun Tefillati, which were like a number of poems that he wrote in Hebrew, like, that served for him as a form of prayer. And he's very into like finding alternative modes of prayer in a way that is like very spiritually enriching. And that, this is again combining the elements of like religious obligation and spiritual fulfillment, as prayer is like a really good locus for these things to coalesce, because so much of the fulfillment of the obligation of prayer is predicated on the experience of prayer. So, you have to pray, but like, how do you have to pray?
Right.
And so I think that, yeah, there's, the way it often gets accepted is that the prayers are good and people like them. And I mean, that's a well-worn tradition, right? A lot of the Pizmonim or Piyutim that are sort of like psalms that were written in the medieval era that we recite on holidays, or the Selichot, which are often said before the days of awe, like the high holidays. Those were written by poets, like Jewish poets in the 13th century and the 12th century, and everyone liked them. So we kept them around and we still recite them. And like, I think that's the way it happens.
Yeah. Nadav Heller, thank you so much for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure. Thank you for having me. This was great.